Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
Just to remind us where we are at this snap, we are at the burning bush, we're at the extended conversation between God and Moshe. We're at Moshe's learning what is being put on Moshe's shoulders, what it's going to take from him. We know the story well, so it's hard to forget what we have or have not yet actually read in the actual verses. But we know that this is a moment of transition of leadership or placement of leadership on Moshe's shoulders and Moshe's hesitancy. There's a lot been written about Moshe's hesitancy in terms of was it a hesitancy regarding himself, a hesitancy regarding the people he was being asked to lead, or a hesitancy regarding Aaron, which we may or may not get to today. And the last bit we spent some weeks on was the series of signs and wonders that God shows to Moshe, both perhaps to convince Moshe that this God's a real God, and perhaps that Moshe will then go into the land of Egypt equipped with some magical wonders so that Moshe can convince others, right? Putting his hand into his bosom, coming out white, coming back in, and it's returning the way it should be. And then we get to verse 8. So there had been, let's just read the pshat of verse 8, and then we'll get to the Rashi. And let me start us off, and then I'll ask for a reader later on. V'haya imlo yaminu lach. And behold, God says to Moshe, if they will not believe you, v'lo yishma'u, and they will not heed, l'kol ha'ot harishon, to the voice, the impact maybe, we talked about that a little bit, of the first sign, ve'eminu, they will indeed believe, l'kol ha'ot ha'acharon, to the voice or impact of the second sign, right? So remember, the first sign was the staff being turned into a snake and then going back to a staff, which is going to be kind of premonition, if that's a word, of the interaction he's going to have with the Egyptians. And the second sign is the momentary, temporary leprosy. We know it's not leprosy, but there's no better English word, sara'at, with which Moshe is stricken before he is healed. And somehow God says, okay, if they don't believe the staff to snake to staff, they're going to believe the normal hand to the white flaky hand to the normal hand. Why? Okay. So since we may have done this, Rashi, let me do this a little bit quicker, and then we'll certainly slow down on verse 9. Right. So Rashi's trying to answer the question, what is it about the second sign that seems to be more convincing than the first sign? Is it just two magic tricks are better than one? Maybe I'll even pause here for a second, whether you remember having read this or not. Is there anything that you would say if you were the commentator here as to what is significant about the secondary sign of leprosy, or leprosy being in place and then healed? All right, Sue, is your hand up? Finish chewing. I want you to choke.
It's almond butter. It's not toast. It's dry.
It's even harder to speak through almond butter.
Well, leprosy was really terrifying and very personal for them, and they had no cure for it, right? I mean, leprosy was a plague. So, it's one thing to throw snakes on the ground. It's an entirely different thing to throw COVID at everyone.
Interesting. So the first one might just seem like flashy magic. The second one portends, their own well-being, and perhaps this God who's represented by this shaliach being able to afflict them and heal them from those kinds of personal plagues. Interesting. Good. Joanna?
I wasn't the one who said this, but I believe that the last time we met, someone made a beautiful connection to Miriam having leprosy, and Miriam having, made a mistake in speaking out against her brother and getting leprosy as a result too. And so to hear it's sort of like a little bit anticipatory. I think both of them, Moshe himself will make mistakes, and the people of Israel, and that, that's going to happen, and we're going to have to work together to overcome that.
Okay, so another way of understanding this verse you're saying, Joanna, perhaps beshame someone else in someone else's name, is that this is presaging a relationship between God and the Jewish people, where there's going to be perhaps an impact for sins that we do, the plague of a leprous condition, and then God's healing, as Miriam's going to experience in the desert, and somehow that makes it maybe more personal than, again, maybe just a fancy trick. It's hard really to reify this and imagine the mind of the Israelite slave servant, not yet knowing the Miriam story, somehow actually being more convinced by the second one. But we're searching here, because there seems to be a significance to number 2, but it's not at all obvious why. And then we'll read Rashi's answer in a second. Tova?
I think someone else also said in a previous session that it also seems to rebound back on Moshe, in that this prolonged conversation is indicating his hesitancy, his seeming doubt at times, his on God himself, and that this is, in a sense, a presaging of, this is revealing something about you, Moshe, that you're having this brief experience. And I don't know if that was a general association with Tzara'at, that it reflected some kind of internal corruption, if you will, and that therefore this would also convey to the people of Israel that if they don't follow, it reflects something about themselves internally.
Great. So if we lean into the idea that the ancient Israelites in Egypt already also knew that this condition came to you for something that you did wrong, right? Then perhaps their leader experiencing it in front of them and then being healed from it, or their potential leader might bring them along in a more personal, intimate way than the previous one. And that's kind of where Rashi goes. Let me read that again. We may have already read it, but it's okay to read it again. They will certainly believe the second sign. Misha tomar lahem. Once you, Moshe, say to them, this is now Rashi speaking in God's voice, because the verse is in God's voice. Bishvilchem lakiti. It was because of you that I was afflicted. Remember that and maybe you don't remember that in the previous few verses, Rashi says that the reason why the second sign is a leprous one is not just a random representation of powers, but Moshe deserved it. Moshe deserved the momentary leprosy. Why did he deserve the momentary leprosy? Because he spread Lashon Hara about the Israelites, saying they're not going to be believable people. They're not going to be believing people. So Moshe articulated a calumny against the Israelites. Midah keneged midah. If you embarrass someone else, even not in their presence, then you deserve to be white-faced and embarrassed as well. So Moshe was stricken with something that he had deserved. And God says, when you tell them that on the way to your becoming a leader, you did something you shouldn't have done, which is speak poorly about them, and then you paid the price for it. Where am I? Bishvilchem lakiti, al shasiparti alechem lashon hara. It's because of you that I was afflicted, because I spoke lashon hara about you. Yaminucha. Now you're going to have some believability. Now you're going to have a certain amount of street cred. Shekfar lamdu b'chach, because they already knew. We have to lean in this commentary to this understanding that the Israelites ensconced in Egypt know the full story of Breshit, right? They have the full inherited understanding of the story of their ancestors. And so they knew the parashot in Breshit and the stories that happened to them, including Shahamizdavgin lahara lahem, that those who would, it's an odd verb, lehizdavig means to, it's from the root zug meaning couple, those who kind of who get close to the Israelites, but for evil purposes, lokim banigaim, are afflicted with plagues. We have several places in Breshit with Avraham and Yaakov, and Yitzchak and Avimelech and others, where the the king of Gerar, Avimelech, and in the king of Egypt back then get afflicted because of things that they're going to do to Abraham or Isaac and their wives. Kegon Parova Avimelech b'shvil Sarah, like the situation where the Avimelech gets smitten because of what he's going to potentially do to Sarah. So this has several moves. First, we assume the Israelites knew those stories. Then we assume that if they know those stories, they trust that someone presenting a God who's going to properly punish someone who has done evil to the Israelites is telling a believable story, even though, parentheses, they've been waiting hundreds of years for that very God to appear and nothing had happened yet. And therefore, God says to Moshe, when you come and you say, what God do I represent? I represent the God that you know. How do you know that? Because I momentarily did something I should have done. I was basically an enemy to the Jewish people. That's a strong way of saying it. But I spoke poorly about you. And I was stricken. See, I can do it again. I can show that to you. That will open the hearts of the Israelites to say, this is a representative of that God. I may not be willing to follow a charlatan who could do a magic trick with a staff and a snake, but this is leading us back to the narrative that we stemmed from. All of that, I think, is built into these 3 lines of Rashi. Let me pause for reactions, comments, questions. I see Larry and Diane's hand up.
Yeah, I like better the explanation that there was historical memory. It's not that we have to believe it was historical memory, but Rashi almost always believes that there was this historical memory, that whatever he knew from the Torah, that the people knew at that time. I can't think of specific examples, but we've done it several times where Rashi has explained that, of course, the people knew that this had happened. But I like it a lot better than thinking that they knew what would happen in the future, that Moshe himself would be struck by the same disease as a punishment. And I think, if I wouldn't make too much of it, I think it's interesting that when in the Torah, when people don't remember, we're told explicitly they don't remember. And Pharaoh arose who did not remember or didn't know Joseph. And I think that there's a lesson here, and I'm really stretching it, which is a people which does not know its history is then condemned to make mistakes based upon that history. So the fact that we knew what we should have known what Surat was, and we should have then believed that this was an important sign, is that message.
Yeah, I don't think that's stretching at all. I think that's exactly the thrust of the Rashi commentary. The reason, like it resolves the problem in the verse, but in doing so, it's a little sermonette on being aware of your inherited story, so that you can see the signs of who's on your side and when God is bursting through history again to be with you. So I think that's exactly the thrust of the Midrash here. To answer, it's Joel's question. According to the Rashi on verse 6, Mitzura'at Kashaleg, that Moshe's temporary Sara'at is because he had said the words Lo Ya'aminuli. They will not believe me. They are not trusting people. They're not, and I mean maybe by extension, and therefore they're not worthy of being saved. But the specific reason is because he said they will not believe me. Joanna?
It's interesting that while we have these earlier stories of people being stricken by a plague, I don't believe we're specifically told it was leprosy. And Rashi, too, here is connecting Lashon Hara specifically to leprosy. And so I wonder maybe if you reverse it, now it becomes much more interesting later when we get to the Miriam story and you read of her getting leprosy there. You know, if Rashi, because I think most people, when you ask them, what's your association of leprosy in the Torah, the first answer is the Miriam story. And so I wonder if Rashi in his, Em Mukdamu Me'uchar kind of way, that there's no early or late in the Torah, is sort of anticipating that and, taking what happened to the forefathers and now setting up a deeper connection specifically between leprosy and Lashon Hara.
Very nice. Very nice. Right, because what Joanna's saying, I think, is really apt. When we get to the Miriam story, we don't say, oh, this brings us back to the pre-Exodus moment at the burning bush. But if we read it through a Rashi lens, then we have an antecedent to that story. We have a someone in Moshe's family, Moshe, not only getting leprosy, but using it as a way of driving home the relationship between God and the Jewish people, and their being willing to come out. So, although I don't think Rashi goes there explicitly, right? He's actually not evoking Miriam here. You're right. It's a Hansel and Gretel breadcrumb that we can then go back to once we get to the Miriam story if we're students of Rashi. Great. Okay, let's move forward. Let's go.
I just wanted to add a bit of information. I realized we did do number 9 because I remember reading it and reading the Rashi, which was a bit of a struggle. So we had done number 9 as well.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to do it again. We'll do it again, maybe a little quicker. Really, we did the Rashi on 9? Okay, I believe you. Let's do it again. Tova, do you want to do it twice? Prefer not. Okay. Carol, do you want to read verse 9?
Sure, although with that introduction, I don't know. Shana Tova, everybody. Good to see everyone.
Carol.
V'haya im lo ya'aminu gam lishnei ha'otot ha'ele v'lo yishma'un lekolech v'lakachta mimeme hayaor v'shafachta hayabasha v'hayu hamayim asher tikach min hayaor v'hayu ledam hayabashet.
Okay, see if you can translate.
And so it was. If
Vavaipuch, so it's and it will be. Looks like was is, but it means it will be because it's the Vavaipuch.
Oh, okay. So I got it. Okay, so it will be if they will not believe also the two signs, these two signs, and they will not listen to or heed your voice, and you will take from the waters of is Yaor specifically the Nile, or
it's
just
a good
river
question.
in general?
It's the Torah's use. It's the Torah's word for this river. But we don't know for sure if it's an ancient biblical word for meaning the main river of a place, in which case it's the Nile, or if this is a proper name. But it's referring to the Nile here.
Right. Okay. The Nile, and you will spill it on the dry land, and it will be that the waters that you take from the Nile, and it will be as blood will become. I guess it will become blood on the dry land.
Good. I think it's in the plague of frogs that you get Yaor in a plural, referring to all the places, all the water sources where the frogs will come. Yaorehem, the Agamehem, something like that. So the Torah seems to use the Yaor more generically as like all of your lakes and canals and rivers. And Onkelos here translates Yaor as Nahara, Nahar, river. So the vocabulary word probably means river, but I suppose HaYaor is, we're supposed to understand it to be the main river, right? And all the commentaries on it, like we'll refer to it as the Nilus. Okay, so great translation. We have now kind of a third act in this potential magic show that Moshe that you're going to do. And if the one with the tzara'at was a peep ahead and a peep back, peep ahead to Miriam, as Joanna's suggesting, a peep back to Avimelech, then this one is certainly a peep ahead, because what he's going to do in front of the Israelites, if they don't believe the first two, is obviously going to be anticipating the first major plague anyway. Okay, what Rashi gets hung up on here, and we'll do this a little bit quickly, is just maybe I shouldn't say just, is a doubling of the word v'hayu. So if we read it carefully, right? Not that you weren't reading it carefully, Carol, but if I just slow it down a little bit, that after the etnachta, after the v'shafachta hayabasha, that you've taken the water from the river and you throw it on the ground, and it will be that the water that you take from the river, and it will be that it will be blood on the ground. So if you slow it down that way and you emphasize that it will be, that the second it will be is extraneous. Because it could have said, and it will be, that the hayu, hamayim, the water, asher tikach, that you've taken, min hayor, from the river, ledam bayabasha, will be blood when it gets to the ground, right? So why the second v'hayu? We probably did this before, but let me just quickly see if Everett Fox's translation makes sense, like even plays around with a second, it shall be. Everett Fox says, and it shall be, that's the first v'hayu. Actually, that's the v'haya in the beginning of the verse. If they do not put their trust, that's how he does ya'aminu, that put their trust in even these two signs and do not hearken to your voice, then take some water of the Nile, he translates yor as Nile here, capital N, and pour it out in the dry land. And look what he does with the second half of the verse. And the water that you take from the Nile will become blood on the dry land. He elides the second v'hayu. He doesn't give us two v'hayus because it doesn't really seem to make sense in English. I'd be curious, even if we did it before, if there are any translations in front of us that seem to have the two v'hayus in there. Larry, Diane, do you have a translation?
We're not home. We have nothing. We're in Avi Peretz land.
You're in Avi Peretz land, but was your hand up?
Yeah, my hand was up for very brief other comments. If you want me to make them now or hold off.
Hold the comment, right? And let me.
One of them was about the translation. One of them was about complaining about the JPS translation because it's completely untrue to the Hebrew.
The JPS translation in the that we have in our Eitz Chaim Chumash.
Yeah, which should be the same one that's on Sefaria.
Let's hear it since we're dealing with translations now.
And if they are not convinced by both these signs and still do not heed you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and it, the water that you take from the Nile, will turn to blood on the ground.
What do you not like about it?
Well, it ignores the hayu.
Right. So it actually in a different structure, it's doing something very similar to Everett Fox's. It's adding in these dashes, which is almost suggested by the double v'hayu, as if there's an interrupted thought. V'hayu, hamayim asher tach mayor, v'hayu, like it's almost as if the Hebrew puts in its own dashes, and then at the other end of the dash, it repeats the verb. So like I'm sympathetic to JPS's attempt there, because otherwise, if you don't do what Everett Fox or JPS did, and you care, as it were, you've got to do something akin to what Rashi does, which is lovely and fantastical, right? With a wonderful punchline. I love the punchline of this one, but it takes some jumps to get there. So, Carol, if you'll read 9.
Okay. Velakachta mimei hayor remez lahem shebimaka Rishona nifra me'elo Elohotam.
All right, pause 1 second. Which book are you reading from?
I'm reading from...
Not from this one, right?
Correct. I'm reading from something I printed from online.
Okay, so that reminds me. This is a very strange thing we're about to... I don't remember that we dealt with this last time. Occasionally, you'll see words within a Rashi commentary in brackets, and then our editor will say at the bottom, Bet Daled Reish B'Tfush Rishon Leita. It's not there in the first printing. But at least the editor of this one, because it's a scholarly version of Rashi, tells us that there were other potential additions to the Rashi text, but we're not clear how original it is. It's very rare that there are words that are attributed to Rashi that don't even appear on our page. And what Carol's reading from, and I'm going to pull up Safari in a second, is a two-part Rashi before we even get to the Rashi that's on our page. And I'll show it to you in a second. And it doesn't even make it onto the editorial chopping block of our version, and I don't understand why, and I don't know how to, and I can't figure it out. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but and I don't know enough about the editorial history of this. But if you look over here, this is Safaria's chapter 4, verse 9, Rashi. I don't actually even know from where Safaria sources the Rashi commentary, right? It's somewhat open source, and the reverse sometimes happens. Sometimes there's a version, some words of Rashi that don't appear on online versions or some versions, but they do appear in ours in brackets with an explanation. This is very uncommon. In fact, I don't remember a single time studying Rashi that I've come across this, at least with this class. So now that we have that in front of us, you can read, Carol, either from your book or the screen. And this is all before we're going to get to the thing that I was setting up about the double v'hayus. So read this. Okay,
because mine doesn't have the parenthetical stuff on your screen.
So there's a double editorial oddity going on here. Okay, go ahead.
So this is from Vilakachta Mimei Hayaor, Remez Lahem Shebemaka Rishona, Nifra Me'elohotam.
Okay, so translate or read the translation. It's right there.
Okay, so from the... So taking from the waters of the river, it is a hint that with the first plague, I don't say Nifra is always bothered.
Here it means to basically to claim recompense, to get payment from, to punish as payment, essentially.
From there, and this is their. Is this? I'm trying to figure out the grammar of. Is it their God singular?
It's really interesting. It's almost taking the pointed version. Somewhere I have a pointed version of this Rashi. The pointed version of this Rashi points that word as. Hold on. Me Ellahutam. Ellahut is like their divine concept, their divinity. It's not their God. Oh. It's like in modern Hebrew, Elahut is the divinity of something, right? The notion of godliness. So Rashi seems to read this as the first thing that God will do when he gets to the Egyptians is to demand payment. Doesn't say from Elohehem, their God, because that would be a very strong way of referencing the things that they believe in as a God, but the thing to which they attribute Elahut, divinity, right? Now, those words, I don't even know which order what to do this. Now read the parentheses, and we'll construct it backwards. Perush.
Perush, Kisha Kadosh Baruch Hu Nifra Min Umot,
yeah.
Nifra me'el Elohutam Techila, Shehayu Ovdim Lenilus.
Yeah, Nile.
Hamechaye Otam, Behafcham Ladam.
Okay. So read that, translate that. So this is almost like a commentary on Rashi in a Rashi that doesn't appear in our very scholarly version of Rashi. It's a weird little rabbit hole. Okay.
So when God exacts retribution from the nations, first exacts it from their deity,
right, or their divine concept, whatever
concept. Because they worshipped the Nile. Mechayeh, is that like it gives them life? I don't know. Mechayeh.
Yes. Like Mechayeh Hametim, the right. Nile, which Mechayeotam, which is the source of their life, which is their lifeblood, right? Which is why, right, the commentaries understand that even though the Hebrew word is Yaor, which might be a generic word, what we're talking about here is Ha-Yaor, the river. Okay?
Right. And then turns that into blood.
And then those two words, Berashi Yashan, in an old Rashi manuscript. It's just weird, because that's the very type of thing that you can imagine appearing in our version, which is the most kind of scholarly version of Rashi out there, maybe in brackets, and telling us that it's in Rashi Yashan. And even here, only the second part of this is Rashi Yashan. The first part seems to be Rashi, right? And I don't think, I'm guessing that no one has a version in front of them of the Rashi commentary where the first line of this is in any way indicated that it's not original Rashi. The second one, yes, but the first, no. And none of it appears in ours. So I don't get it. But it's okay that I don't get it, but I don't get it. What's going on here in terms of content is we talked about, jumping forward and jumping back in Emuk Damu Muchaber Torah, right? The significance, according to this Rashi, if Rashi indeed wrote it, is that Y is sign number 3, right? Sign number 2 was staff. Sign number 1 was staff and snake. Sign number 2 was Moshe and Sara'at and Avimelech and Miriam. Sign number 3 is water turning to blood. And not only is it generically, or actually that's the wrong word, not only is it pointing us to the first plague that's going to happen, it's also giving us a klal that the Israelites may be needed to know, which is that when God comes to smite a foreign nation that has been bad to the Jews, God first smites the divinity or the deity or the divine concept, because the river is not just water, it is, or was to the Egyptians, itself a god, right? A source of divine power and illumination. Rick?
I just had some trope observations that I wanted to share at some point, so I just thought I'd say that. So if you're ready now, or you want to do it later?
I'm ready for it now.
Yeah. Okay.
What time is it? Yeah, we have time, because I want to make sure we actually get through the Rashi that apparently we did 6 weeks ago anyway, so we can get some new material. But I think we're already doing some version of new material, because I don't remember looking at this Rashi Yashan last time. Rick?
Yeah. We're going back and forth, like you said, back and forth between these two verses 8 and 9 and what actually happens when Moses gets to the elders. It's like it doesn't match. God is saying, well, if they don't believe this, they'll believe this. And ve'aminu, the trope there is very calm. There's not even a pashta with it. There's no munach with it. It's very rare just to have a zakef katon on the top of ve'aminu. They're just sitting there by itself. And you would think that believing would have more a more intense trope to it. That's just an observation. Then in the next sentence, you got two pazers on God says, well, if they don't believe you, then here's a third one. And it's very rare to have two pazers. The only other place I can think is in the Ten Commandments. But when you finally get to, and there's other vocabulary here, yishma'u, there's other words here, okay? But the next time you have a pazer is when Moses meets the people, and it's in verse 31. I think I said this before. I don't remember.
Yes, I think you did.
Okay.
Say it again.
And it's on Vayishma'u. So the bottom line is they did believe. They didn't even need to get to the third one. They believe after the first two. And what I could find there in verse 30 is another Zakef Katon on Kol Hadvarim. It's very simple. It's not very dramatic and stuff. But Aaron says these things, and Moses does the sign, the two of them, and then verse 31 they believe vaya amen. So it's weird to me that the two places don't match up, and then let alone what happens when they get to Pharaoh. So I just wanted to say that.
Great. The first part of what you said, the kind of truncated staccato katon in the previous verse. It's always interesting when a note, which is usually part of a couplet, appears on its own. So if you're not a Torah reader, that comment doesn't make as much sense. But if you just look at what Rick was looking at in verse 8, actually look at that. There's the munach that should have been van veheminu was put in earlier. You have two munachs where there should be one, and there's no munachs where there should be one. V'haya im lo munach one lo yaminu munach tu lach velo yishmeu l'kol atacharon. What Rick is saying is that veheminu is a katon. A katon by itself is odd. It's like a Q without a U, right? Yes. It's almost, I don't know, over 99% of the time that you have a katon, you've got a munach before it. And this is actually a long enough word that it could have been a word where you put a munach katon in the word. Veheminu, but it's just veheminu, and it's a little bit rushed through it. I think the double pazer, Rick, is rare, but not as rare as you think. I can't think of obvious examples. It's definitely in the Ten Commandments, but I think it's a little more common than you might think. But I accept all the things that you're saying. Okay, thanks. Tova. And then we're going to finish this Rashi.
Right. By the way, this is definitely new. We didn't do this last time.
Okay.
So comment on what we were reading. I wonder if I was stumbling a little bit on the translation of retribution against the divinity and the use of that Elohutam. Elahutam. Because the image that evoked for me was retribution in the sense of literally taking away from the perceived divinity, reducing the divinity. So it's not just sort of an insult to what's perceived as divine, but in the eyes of the Egyptians seeing it is a challenge to their perception of it being divine at all, which casts light forward on the impact of the plagues.
Mm. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think about. How do you exact recompense from a divinity that you don't consider to be a divinity?
Right.
Is it reducing that divine source's significance in the eyes of the people who view it with divinity, or are you actually doing something to it? So here it seems to be that when the Egyptians are going to see their god water stricken, right, the injury is to the Egyptians, right? Not to the god water, because we don't think the god water is anything anyway.
Right. So it's not so much that the actual divinity is injured, but the perception of it being divine is injured. I
think so, and I appreciate that subtlety, Tova, and you're bringing that up. Right, and it's interesting language. If we want to do Rashi on Rashi, right? If we want to do Rashi on maybe Rashi, right? Because this is well, the Nifra me Elahutan appears both in the first part of this comment and the second part. The second part is almost certainly not Rashi. The first part might be Rashi. Nifra, which is a interesting verb anyway, because it's a verb that is basically in the nifal form, but somehow it's active. It really means the subject of Nifra is God, but it's really exacting payment from the Elahutan or whatever the second half of the line, but it's written in a form that normally is passive. So it's a weird verb anyway, and from their Elahut, from their godness, or the Egyptian sense of what is godly about that river. Joanna?
So while you were away and we met a few times, I happened to be reading a Rashi one day off of Sefaria that was different than anything. There were 2 or 3 editions of Rashi around the table. The virtual table, and what I was reading off of Sefaria was different than what anyone else had. And without going into that now, it intrigued me enough to write to Sefaria.
Wow.
And they answered me and they told me where they based it on, and which was not the Leipzig edition, but the edition that they copied off of, a 1934 edition is what appears, is not available online. But they said that edition is based on the Leipzig edition, which is available online, and they directed it to me. And I just opened that edition, and the comment there is fascinating. The Leipzig edition, by the way, is one of the most authoritative because there happens to be a note at the beginning of the person who wrote that manuscript said he was copying off of the manuscript of Rashi's secretary. So that note is very informative in terms of, origin and being fairly early. And so the website that has the Leipzig edition on it has a footnote at the bottom of the page that handwritten in Paris edition number 155, there is this edition, what we just read. And at the end of that footnote, it lists 5 more editions that have it and 5 that don't, that I'm not familiar with, the manuscripts that they're referring to, but I can only presume that they're early manuscripts. And it's interesting that it's tracked here.
What fascinating gumshoe work that you did there. I was taping the background because I just saw an email from Barry Rosenblatt that he had a hard time getting onto the Zoom, and I was just sending him the link again. So I apologize about that. I hope there are others who are not struggling to get on. Fascinating. I have nothing to add, but that's just fascinating. I love the fact that we live in a world where you can write Sefaria and they'll write back, and that you can track how it's both open source and also very highly and intentionally curated how these texts get in front of us. Beautiful. Thank you, Joanna. Larry Dayan, you're not going to let us finish this, are you?
I'll be real quick. One of the things I wanted was to ask Rick to comment on the trope. I'm glad he did. I'm sorry he didn't mention also the Kadma Va'azla at the beginning. But the other trope question that I have is...
L'shnei Otot. Yeah, got it. Okay.
And the other trope question that I had is, it just seemed to me that the Etnachta is misplaced, because I would have placed the Etnachta on the Kolecha, because that's the antecedent to the whole thing. But then if you read Rashi, it kind of explains why they placed that Etnachta where they did, because of the separation of what you want to get to about Rashi's explanation in second Rashi. So I'm not going to steal your thunder there. But I want to ask,
who's the they that you're referring to in terms of who put the trap? It's
the Masoretes.
It's the Kadosh Baruch Hu. What are you talking about?
Okay, well, so why God, not he, wanted to direct us to that. But the other question that I had before we get to the second Rashi is, in the first Rashi, so I'm just going to read the English translation, okay? You shall take the water of the river, and it says, he alluded to them, so question mark, who is them? That with the first plague, he will exact retribution from their deity. So to be consistent, their deity would be the Egyptians. But this is all directed toward the Israelites, not to the Hebrews. It's not directed toward the Egyptians. So I don't understand to whom Rashi is referring, or the putative Rashi in this first Rashi, who the them is, who the them and the there are.
Yeah. Great. Maybe this is why the editor of our edition of Rashi decided he doesn't even belong on the page. What Larry's asking is really interesting in terms of who is denoted in the pronouns or the prepositional pronouns in the first part of this maybe Rashi, because the context we are in right now is still God trying to convince Moshe that Moshe convinced the Israelites to follow him. We're not yet in God trying to convince Moshe that he'll be able to be effective in front of the Egyptians. We're just, if they don't listen to the first two signs, they'll listen to the third. So the Ramaz Lahem, God, it's interesting because Rashi is kind of speaking in God's voice, because the V'lakachta Memei Hayor is God's voice. But what's really going on here is Rashi saying that in God reinforcing this to Moshe, through Moshe, God was hinting to them, which I initially read as the Israelites, hinting to them what? Some concept, which is actually not that integral to the moment, but it's going to be integral later on, that when this God comes and smites the Egyptians, if you listen to Moshe and agree to be led by Moshe, the first thing that God is going to smite is that which is most sacred to them. But you're right that the Lahem and Elahutam, them, hinted to them and their divinity, maybe should match, in which case it's God through Moshe hinted to the Egyptians who were maybe watching the scene between Moshe and the Israelites that watch out, folks. If this thing happens, if I become this leader and they agree to follow me, your gods are going to be smitten first. It's a little wonky. And again, we have no idea if Rashi wrote this, and it's odd to me that that our manuscript, as we said before, doesn't have it. All of that leads us to the Rashi that we may have done. This may be the Rashi that Tova broke her teeth on last time, which is almost certainly Rashi and is a bit of a maze, but at the end of the maze there's something lovely, and we'll see if we can get through that quick enough to actually start the next verse, which may be the first true new material. So, Carol, do you want to read the next one? Do you want me to just do this quicker? Up to you.
Well, I'll try. Okay. I've been practicing.
Good.
V'hayu hamayim v'gomer. V'hayu shtei pa'amim. Nir'eh be'enai. Ilu ne'emar v'hayu hamayim asher takach min hayor ledam b'yabashet. Shomea ani shebe'ado hem nehafchim ledam. Ve'af k'sheyardu la'aretz yihu bihyutan.
V'haviatan.
V'haviatam.
Right. That v'haviatan is created from the gerund of the verb to be, havaya. Okay. They will be as they had been, in their very being. They will continue to be as they were.
Aval achshav melamdenu shelo yiyudam ad sheyu bayabashet.
Okay.
Excuse me. So the V'hayu, so it will be, excuse me, happens two times. It appears to me if it said, and it will be that the water that you take from the Nile, from the river, becomes blood on the dry land. I hear that in your hand it turns into blood, and so when it goes to the dry land, it stays the same. It becomes the same or stays the same.
Good.
But now we learn that it does not become blood until it hits the dry land.
Okay, so we have three things to do here, right? After Carol translated it perfectly. One, make sure we understand what Rashi is seeing in the verse, right? Two, then put the whole comment together, and then three, ask the question, so what? And footnote 9, which is quoting the Levush HaOra, which is a 16th century super commentary on Rashi written by Rabbi Mordechai Yaffe from the Prague, Bohemia area, gives us some sense as to why this is even happening, right? So remember we said that the two V'hayus are weird. And what Rashi says is, if the second V'hayu were not there, I might understand it to mean that the water which you take from the river will be like blood. It will be like blood. As soon as the water is in your hand, it will be turned to blood, and it will remain blood when it's thrown on the ground. But the second V'hayu separates the ideas, and it says that water that you take in your hand from the river, which is still water, it's water in your hand. V'hayu, what's going to happen? When that water hits the yabashet, hits the ground, it's going to be blood. Okay, an extremely subtle distinction. And maybe it's compelling that second V'hayu makes it even more clear that the water is not going to be turning to blood until it hits the ground. Not that I think any of us would have had the supposition that had the second V'hayu not been there, we would have said, oh my goodness, that means that the water's turning to blood in his hand. But the next level is, so what, right? So let's say Rashi is right. Let's say that the second Hayu reinforces to us that the trajectory of this miracle is a man scoops up water from the river, holds water in the hand, it looks like water, throws it onto the ground, and as soon as it hits the ground, it turns to blood. Why is that more significant than the possibility that when he scoops up water in his hand, the water is already bloody, and then it just remains bloody as he throws it? So, Rebecca, Joanna, Tova.
So let me know if my sound is coming through, because my computer is being weird that way. and hopefully you hear me.
We hear you.
I really like this Rashi because it sort of highlights and defines what I saw as the difference between these first two otot and the third one, which was that the first two were reversible, while the third one seems to be irreversible. And so by saying it's not happening in his hand, you can't just throw it back into the oil and it will turn to water. It's just a very, it's a finite, I don't know how to say this exactly, but it's an irreversible phenomena, and therefore it's more convincing than the first two are taught that might be just magic, that, sleight of hand, quick, quick motion, a sleight of hand that a magician would do.
Good. So the sleight of hand part is exactly how the Levush HaOrah reads it, which is that if I thought that the water had turned to blood in his hand, I might have thought he was holding on to some dye in his hand that wasn't obvious beforehand, and he puts the water in his hand, and magically it turns to water, it turns to blood. But if it's water in his hand, and then he throws it in the air, and as it's falling into the air and it hits the ground, it turns to blood, that can't be done with magic dye. Therefore, it's more powerful. Therefore, the God he represents is more powerful. That's how the Levush HaOrah reads it. You're reading it that way. Plus, you're saying that the water being blood when it hits the ground, it dissipates. It's no one can pull that water up again and undo that. And therefore it's a more powerful symbol. I suppose one could say to that even if it's the case that if the water were blood in his hand, which at that point you might say he's still holding it so he could reverse it, once he throws it onto the ground, it's dispersed. There's no way to collect it again. That for that second part of it is just as powerful, independent of when the water turned into blood, right? Which is the point that Rashi is driving home here. But yes, there's something final about this miracle. It's not just going to be reversed by a counter spell, right? Like a Harry Potter counter spell. Joanna and Tova.
So I was basically going to say the same thing about that, so I won't go there. But if I may, I just wanted to go back to Larry's last comment, because I think it's quite a fascinating interpretation, because at the end of chapter 3, God is talking to Moses about going in front of the Egyptians. And our chapter 4 marking is pretty much an artificial marking added later by Christians. So chapter 4 could continue on. And I realize, though, that at least for me, every time I see chapter 4 and I start reading there, I always read the them as the Israelites. But I think there's a possible read that from the very beginning of chapter 4 until now, the them, the people that Moshe is going to be talking to about what if they do not believe me, is continuing the conversation that God had just initiated at the end of chapter 3, that the them is the Egyptians. And even when we get to 5, that they may believe in the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that there's a possible read there. It wasn't a problem for other nations to have other deities, right? So their deity of the Nile was the most powerful, but there could be other deities, and getting them to realize, oh, hey, the Israelites also have a God protecting them. Maybe we need to be careful. And then in what we're going to do next week, when Aaron first comes into the picture to be the spokesperson, it's Moses continuing to raise his concerns. The first part of 4 is his concern about going in front of the Egyptians. And when we get to verse 10 next week, now, okay, so that's been addressed, but now I have a concern about going in front of the Israelites.
Fascinating. So what you're commenting on, Joanna, is pure pshat, because it's pretty clear, particularly with the first 2 plagues, that Rashi's commentary is reading it as Moshe being nervous about the Israelites believing him. But Rashi is not the only person to study Torah, and we're entitled to our own interpretation. And I have to think more about that, because I'd never considered that. I have to think more about whether or not, particularly like as you mentioned, you did a good job of naming the bugaboo in your own commentary, which is the Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak. But I want to think about if this flow can make sense, where all of the thems that are being referenced are the Egyptians and not the Israelites. And it's certainly would make it a little bit easier to deal with the V'ramaz lehem be'elahutam in that Rashi, which may not be Rashi. Yeah, interesting. Tova, maybe get the last comment of the day.
Okay, going to the what we were talking about before about the blood when it leaves his hands, water when it leaves his hands becoming blood. I was thinking maybe in addition to getting away from the idea that somehow it's a trick, getting away from the idea that somehow it is the power of Moshe that is affecting this change, that he scoops the water, it's water in his hand when he throws it, and it becomes blood. That's not anything coming from him, that's God.
Oh, great.
So it emphasizes more the real source of these ot.
Great. I love that. So that's like a parallel commentary to the Levusha's commentary on Rashi. Yeah. The moment that the transition is happening is after Moshe has no longer touching it. So Moshe is the instrument, but God is the miracle worker. I love that. Really, really good.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.